Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm having some web issues, but I'm joined via phone. So if my video fritzes, do not worry. You still should be able to hear me via audio. Good afternoon. Welcome to the third and final installment of the MicroCredentials webinar series. Some of you may have been with us for our first two sessions, and if so, thank you for coming with us on this journey. And if you're new to this series with this installment, no worries. We're glad that you've joined us today, and we also record our webinars if you want to catch up. My name is Erica Vaverka, and I'm Director of K-12 at the Hunt Institute. For those unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute, we were founded by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt, and serve as a resource for policymakers on education policy through in-person and virtual convenings, research, and other forms of technical assistance. Before providing an overview of this series, I want to acknowledge Myra Best of DigiLearn for her leadership and partnership in the development of this series, and we're grateful to have her joining us for this discussion. I also want to thank our speakers for participating in today's conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about policies concerning microcredentials and what policies that are effective in gaining traction. And before we jump in, just want to provide a brief logistical overview and structure for today's conversation. We're going to have about 30 minutes of conversation, and after that, we're going to open the floor for audience Q&A. Audience mics are muted, so if you have a question, please enter it using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we also encourage you to participate in the conversation on social media with the hashtag MicroCredentials series. It's up there and we'll include it in the chat for you. Looking forward to today's discussion. And as I mentioned, I'm honored to partner with DigiLearn to showcase this important topic. And so with that, I'll turn it over to DigiLearn's Executive Director, Myra Best, who will provide remarks and introduce our moderator, Tom Vander Ark. Myra, over to you.
Thank you, Erica. On behalf of DigiLearn, we're delighted to partner with the Hunt Institute to provide this series on microcredentials. Microcredentials, as you know, are a big step toward giving teachers voice and choice in their own professional learning, because teachers know best about what they need, and they also know best about what learning their students need. Last year, DigiLearn partnered with the North Carolina State Board of Education to investigate the use of microcredentials as a tool for teacher recruitment, development, career advancement, and ultimately improving the overall teaching profession. When we began the work, we did begin with the understanding that for microcredentials to be a meaningful tool, three things needed to be in place. One, microcredentials do need to be integrated with the state system of professional learning so they can be portable, allow teachers to receive credit for them across the state. And they have to be a part of that structure, that policy structure. Microcredentials also need to be aligned with effective professional development. And third, teachers do need to be recognized for acquiring those extra skills and knowledge if it makes them a more effective teacher and improves student success. As we began the work and as we went through, we began to identify some key issues that needed to be addressed for effective implementation of microcredentials. One is there needs to be a common definition. There are multiple definitions being used, but you need to have a common understanding of what microcredentials are. You need to also develop some consistent quality assurance standards. At present, vendors determine what those standards are, so there's no rhyme nor reason to them. And third, we need to learn more about microcredentials' influence on teacher practice and student achievement. As we investigated what was going on in other states that were using microcredentials, we found that they were facing the very same issues that we were looking at. And that is the definition, the quality assurance standards, and also the fact that we need more data. As a result, we have developed a multi-state partnership to develop solutions for those issues that we identified. And today you're going to hear from some of those states and organizations about policies and best practices that are needed if we're going to implement microcredentials effectively. So it's my pleasure now to introduce today's moderator, Tom Vander Ark. an author, a speaker, CEO of Getting Smart, and he's a valued member of DigiLearn's board of directors. As CEO of Getting Smart, he advises schools, districts, networks, foundations, and learning organizations on finding the path forward with innovation. He's a proven leader, an innovator, and an effective thought partner. His commitment to innovation and learning makes him a perfect moderator for our final segment on micro-credentials. So I'm handing it off to you, Tom, and thank you so much for being our moderator.
Thank you, Myra. It's an honor to be with all of you. Thanks for joining today. Like many people on the call, I've been thinking about and working on personalized professional learning for teachers for 20 or 30 years. And I'm really excited about the panelists that are joining us today who are leading work at scale in teacher micro-credentialing. I'll quickly mention the panelists. We have Dr. Ann Kaufman from the NEA, Michelle Mills-Miles from Learning Forward, Dr. Tom Tomberland from North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, and Babette Ray, a program advisor in Arkansas, the Arkansas Department of Education. Welcome to each of you. I'm excited, like our audience is, to learn more about your leadership on micro-credentials. Dr. Kaufman, I'd love to start with you. Your work has resulted in NEA's leadership on micro-credentials. You've also written extensively about teacher preparation, but we'd love to know today about maybe you could tell us the backstory of why you and NEA became interested in and became a provider of micro-credentials.
For sure. Thank you for the opportunity. So about 6 or 7 years ago, we had a bit of a, I guess you'd call it sort of a trying to figure out what to do, because we hear from our teachers all the time that professional learning, and research backs this up, professional learning is not applicable to what they need, especially pre-pandemic. And I think post-pandemic, we're finding that even more. So, or I guess during pandemic. Anyway, so we heard about my former supervisor, Segun Eubanks, who used to be the director of teacher quality at NEA, stumbled across this idea of micro-credentials, and we were looking for more and more ways to provide personalized professional learning. So as at the same time that we created micro-credentials, we started creating a lot of blended learning courses and more digital tools in general. But in micro-credentials, we really made the decision to go all in. And at the time, I remember him saying, this is either going to be the best thing ever, or it's going to be like Beanie Babies, and we're going to forget in 5 years what this is. So I don't think we've reached the Beanie Babies stage. It's just gained more and more attention over the years. As of right now, NEA has over 190 micro-credentials. All of our micro-credentials are written for educators by educators. So we bring in groups of member teachers who and paraprofessionals, other sorts of education support professionals. We bring them in as they show knowledge and expertise in a particular area, that we guide them through writing. We help write the rubrics and all of those sorts of things, and then we move forward. All of our micro-credentials are also assessed by members. So members, they were always free to members, but then we made the decision to, it's expensive, as I'm sure you've heard if you've been in this series. It's kind of a hard business model when you're trying to make money on micro-credentials. We will never make money on micro-credentials, but the idea of being able to allow and promote educators to be in charge of their own professional learning, not only in what they're taking as individualized, these competency-based pieces, but also in the ability to create it, right? So that's sort of how and why we got started in the micro-credential space.
And Anne, about how many teachers have participated in your program?
So in the last 2 years, maybe 3 years, We've had about 12 to 15,000 educators go through. Numbers skyrocketed after the pandemic started, especially, of course, around topics focused on digital learning, but it also became, quite frankly, a way for education support professionals and educators who may have been on pause in some cases in their school districts to still continue their professional learning and try to keep moving.
Any way to assess the impact on practice? How do you think about that?
So the way we promote offering micro-credentials through professional learning communities. Of course, there's always going to be teachers or educators who want to take them independently for whatever box they need checked for licensure. And that's part of the discussion I'm hoping that we'll have through here. But we believe the best way to influence practice is by educators learning together. And research supports that. We know that if educators work together on a common problem, you are more likely to impact practice. And so that is what we've been promoting. So during the pandemic, we've had digital, online PLCs running so that educators could identify and work in small groups with a lead educator to help guide them through the process. And then each of them are then submitting their own micro-credentials for review.
Thank you, Anne. Michelle Mills-Miles from Learning Forward. You've been working with micro-credentials now for over a decade in at least 3 different jobs. I'd love a quick overview of the work that Learning Forward is doing on micro-credentials, but maybe you could start with your micro-credential origin story and the work that you did at the Tennessee Department of Education.
Sure, Tom. Thank you. And again, I just want to say what an honor it is to be part of such an esteemed panel. Like Anne, my micro-credential journey goes back not quite a decade, but closer to about 7 years. And that began at the Tennessee Department of Education, where I was charged with leading a pilot at that time, a statewide pilot on micro-credentials. And so we curated a variety of micro-credentials that were tightly connected to our teacher evaluation rubric to try to, as we've heard, offer some voice and choice, but in areas that we knew teachers would be relevant to the greatest number of teachers across the state. So that went really well, but like not all good things come to an end, but as we will talk about, I think ran into a challenge of change in priorities along with leadership, which is a risk to micro-credentials. And again, I hope we get into that part of the discussion a little bit later and offer some solutions or possible solutions there. But so that's the origin of my journey with micro-credentials. And so here I am at Learning Forward.
And tell us how Learning Forward is involved in micro-credentials.
Well, we have one of the main ways that we're engaging with micro-credentials right now is through some clients that we have. Particularly, I'd like to point out our partnership with the Louisiana Department of Education. So they have instituted policy that supports micro-credentials. Specifically, our work focuses on their Mentor Academy. So in this case, we design and implement the learning around their Mentor Academy. And those who participate in the academy will then take that learning and go on to practice and then make their way through earning the Mentor micro-credentials, which also leads to certification. So you can see there are lots of intersections between micro-credentials and policy with that one project, but that is one, right now, the major way that Learning Forward is interacting with micro-credentials.
What would you say is how would you describe the challenges in the Learning Forward work? Is it on the cost front, on the quality assurance front? What challenges do your lead customers point to?
I think that that probably in prior years, the funding, and then again, the support at the policy level. But certainly the funding has been a challenge. Now that we have so much federal funding, I believe that will go a long way in terms of being able to design and integrate micro-credentials in a way that is sustainable. And of course, with Learning Forward, our focus is always on high quality professional learning. And what we hope to see and what we encourage with our clients is that micro-credentials be embedded in a professional learning system. We do run the risk of micro-credentials, continuing to be isolated and one-off. And just like Ann said there, that it's so important and critical that micro-credentials be done in a learning community and be integrated into a system that then really enhances the possibility of them being sustained.
I appreciate that. And you began by talking about your experience in Tennessee, and state leadership can be so important in signaling the benefit and helping to create a strategic framework and in having a reimbursement structure. So I'd love to turn our attention to North Carolina. Dr. Tom Tomberlin is with us. Tom, the state of North Carolina has signaled intent to move forward with a micro-credential program as well as an outcome-based licensure program. I think your team is leading both of those. We'd love an overview of how North Carolina has been involved and what the path forward looks like for you.
Sure. So yes, North Carolina is currently in the process of redesigning our licensure and compensation system for teachers to focus more on student impact and outcomes rather than inputs into the system. And so as part of that, we are exploring the possibility of micro-credentials used in the renewal process and in the actual initial licensure process. So when you think about kind of the policy challenges related to that, you have to think about those two things kind of independently. So for the purposes of licensure renewal, we have a really deep interest in ensuring that we've defined what a micro-credential is and have standards around rigor and relevance related to those micro-credentials. So they serve teachers, but also there needs to be flexibility for our public school units that they can implement micro-credentials for their local context. They may have certain programs or practices that need professional learning associated with them. And we believe micro-credentials or this kind of competency-based professional learning could serve those purposes well. On the other side, the side that I'm most interested in is establishing licensure for the purposes of issuing a license, making sure that teachers have the requisite skills and competencies to perform the job before we license them. And so for that particular challenge, of course, licensure is a statewide enterprise, not a local enterprise. So we need micro-credentials that are clearly defined. They are the same micro-credentials for everyone engaged in that licensure process, and that we're sure that we're covering the right behaviors and that teachers need to be successful in the classroom, and that they're measured in an authentic setting. So we don't believe that this should be some kind of academic exercise, but actually demonstration of those skills and competencies in the presence of students. And so one of the really big challenges for us as well is ensuring that the assessment of the quality of the micro-credential is done in a way that's valid and reliable and ensures equity across all the applicants. So those are the small challenges we're facing and how we implement micro-credentials for this purpose.
Tom, I'm curious, how important is it to have one or more flagship school districts in your state that are making effective use of micro-credentials? Is that an important precondition in order to create a statewide policy like you're creating? Is that useful for other practitioner leaders to see an active system and do other policy makers need to see a good working example?
I think it's incredibly important as we look to roll out a statewide initiative. What we have is the benefit of lots of grassroots investigation into micro-credentials, so that we're not laying something on schools and districts that's totally foreign to them. There's lots of communication, lots of buzz about the use of micro-credentials. And so as the state kind of adopts this, you've already got this kind of local understanding of what these things are and what the purposes are behind them, that helps us with implementation. And it's not fully a top-down designation of this is how we're gonna proceed. We're simply responding to what we're seeing bubbling up from the field, and that's a much easier implementation route than the alternative.
I'll give a quick shout out to our friends at DigiLearn, who were active in supporting a number of systems across North Carolina and standing up high quality examples, local examples of uses of micro-credentials in a strategic and effective way. So I wonder, Michelle, would you say that there were effective uses in Tennessee before the state began their investigation into micro-credentials?
I actually would. There were a number of districts that had embarked on their journey before the state engaged with them. Putnam County was one, Clarksville, Montgomery. Some of those had already developed relationships with Digital Promise at the time and other vendors, whereas we saw in other places they learned from the established vendors, but then went off and began to customize and create their own. Of course, the having the ability to assess all the micro-credentials that come in remains a challenge. You heard Dr. Kaufman refer to the member teachers as assessors, and that is a great solution. But it's hard to find that level of capacity. But we certainly did have individual districts who had begun the work of micro-credentials before the state got involved. And we turned to them to learn from their experiences as we developed the way our program and implementation the way it would look.
Thank you, Michelle. A great example of a state leading on micro-credentials is Arkansas. Babette Ray leads the work for the Arkansas Department of Education, which is they've had more than 1,000 micro-credentials earned by Arkansas teachers. Babette, when did Arkansas get involved in micro-credentials? And same question for you, were there some good early district examples that accelerated your progress?
Babette, I believe you're on mute.
Thank you. Yes, Arkansas probably began working with micro-credentials around 2017. I came to the department, I was there a year in September. So my position was created specifically to kind of bring together the work that had been started and then push it forward. So I think that a lot of what we have done around micro-credentials began because we revisited our rules for professional development for teachers. The Office of Innovation for Education at the University of Arkansas conducted several focus groups with teachers around the state to ask them what was important concerning professional development. And not surprisingly, regardless of the area of the state, teachers all wanted the same things with professional development. They wanted professional development that was personalized, that's relevant to their classroom practice. They were tired of a one-size-fits-all professional development experience. They wanted professional development that recognized them for the skills they already had and brought to the table. And then they wanted professional development that would support their growth and student achievement. So if you're familiar with micro-credentials, you recognize that they check all of those boxes. So Arkansas started looking at ways that we could support teachers in earning micro-credentials. And I think one of the first things is that we had to acknowledge that they were going to be part of a comprehensive system of professional development. We don't want all the other kinds of professional development to go away, but we do see micro-credentials as an extension of an overall system of quality PD. Second, we are trying to promote awareness of micro-credentials. It's kind of the buzzword. And so we realized that we needed to take a step back and make sure that we kind of have a systematic campaign and make sure that we're all using the same language when we talk about micro-credentials. That's one reason that DigiLearn's work is appealing to us, because we do want to see those standards around micro-credentials. And then third, we want to see teachers rewarded for earning micro-credentials. So we have districts that offer stipends to teachers when they complete micro-credentials. We have some districts that have adjusted their salary schedules. So when teachers earn a stack or a certain number of micro-credentials, they get a small bump on the salary schedule. We're trying to bring HR into conversations so that they might do something as simple as adding quality points when teachers interview if they have earned micro-credentials. So we're really trying to think of ways that we can promote as an agency micro-credentials. Then as far as policies, we have put in place some structures around micro-credentials. Currently, teachers that are seeking to add a master professional or lead professional designation on our career continuum can do that through stacks of micro-credentials. We have vetted those against teacher leader model standards. And then another structure that we're working on is around licensure. So we are using micro-credentials as part of an alternative assessment plan for licensure. So a teacher who has completed a program of study, but has not made the qualifying score on the praxis, but they're close. They're within a range that has been approved by the State Board of Education. They can earn a micro-credential to demonstrate their content knowledge with students. So that is something that we feel very confident that it's going to help us with that teacher retention issue. We also allow teachers who are on a non-traditional pathway to licensure to use micro-credentials as their demonstration of pedagogy or their pedagogy assessment. And then finally, we're developing micro-credentials as a state agency that support what we have identified as high priority initiatives. Arkansas was awarded a state personnel development grant, and part of that funding is being used to develop micro-credentials around high leverage practices. And so we want to be able to offer those to teachers at no cost.
I bet that's an interesting point. I'm curious about the micro-credential library in Arkansas. How many would you say were developed by national providers, and how many have you developed either at the department or in a Arkansas school district? What's the mixture between national providers and do it yourself?
Okay, right now, all of our designated pathways for a lead professional or master professional designation, those are through outside providers. And so we have worked with them to create stacks that we feel support the demonstration of leadership skills that we want teachers to have in those roles. The Arkansas Grow Your Own Micro-Credentials is very new. So we're kind of calling it our soft launch in January. So we have a couple of pilot groups that have been working on those initial micro-credentials that we have developed. And then as part of our Love Teacher Week in February, we're going to really have more of a grand opening. But that's going to be a slow process to develop. Again, we want to make sure that it's quality professional development, that it supports something that is an initiative that we feel is important for the classroom. And then we are using teachers that have earned leader master designations as assessors. And so that training and providing them an opportunity as a reward for earning that designation is something that we feel is important.
Bobette, I'm going to shift gears and move into about 10 minutes of drill down on best practices. I want to start with this question of making the learning strategic, of finding this balance between teacher voice and choice and what to learn and how to demonstrate it, but making the learning strategic for the system. Have you found that some school systems in Arkansas have limited or prioritized particular micro-credentials that were particularly important for their strategic plan?
Absolutely. We have districts that are using it as a retention tool for teachers. So, for example, one district has created stacks of micro-credentials. And if a teacher earns 30 micro-credentials, they will move them to the same level on their salary schedule as a master's degree. That superintendent knows that not every superintendent in the state is going to honor that. So that's a retention tool to keep those teachers in his district. So yeah, people are starting to do things that are thinking outside the box. And we want to encourage that and that autonomy of local districts.
And I guess at the state level and at the local level, have you seen progress in linking this to licensure, linking it to compensation? How have you helped to make it valuable for teachers?
Well, I think that, again, districts control their own salary schedules in Arkansas. So we can encourage and we can offer ways that they might look at their typical salary schedule differently. We, around the licensure, we have really, I have interviewed lots of teachers that have earned micro-credentials, and the most emotional stories around the impact they're having is on teachers who are using them as part of an alternative assessment plan to licensure. So those that are close to that qualifying score, and we allow them to supplement the score with the micro-credential. So a lot of those teachers have said they were at the end of their rope. They had their last try, and they were ready to leave the profession. And when you talk to them and you realize what they bring to the table and offer students, you see what a huge disadvantage that would be if they gave up and didn't follow that dream into the classroom.
I want to acknowledge that in the chat, I appreciate all the chat contributions, questions, and examples. One, for example, is Barack Ilmaz from Harmony Public Schools in Texas. They have about 60 high-performing STEM-focused schools, and they have one of the best micro-credential deployments in the country. It's strategically linked to their strategic plan. It's part of their teacher development and compensation system. So this is a very robust, now mature example of incorporating micro-credential strategies as the primary professional learning for a system. So thanks for that, Barack. Tom, let me come back to North Carolina. Do you think your efforts are mature enough to comment on best practices, either on strategic identification of topics, quality assurance measures, and then links to licensure?
So no, the work is nascent at this point. What we are confident in is we've got a what we think is a good set of standards and skills that teachers need to demonstrate. So we're in search of the micro-credentials that support those activities. And I'm referencing, there's a lot of them out there, like, you know, these high leverage practices for instruction that we really have identified those as being really good indicators of initial teacher success and pointing to effective teaching in later years. So we really want to try to leverage those for the licensure system and find micro-credentials that support those activities. I do have to say that while we're exploring the use of micro-credentials as part of this, we're not letting go of any of the other requirements that we have for licensing teachers. In other words, we still want to maintain those assessments, the content and the pedagogy assessments as a possible pathway. And I think something that's important here is we're trying to establish micro-credentials as an equivalent pathway, not as a supplement to the existing. And one of the reasons around that is we find in North Carolina, there's the licensure exams are an obstacle to licensure, primarily for our teachers of color, that disproportionately they fail these tests more than their majority counterparts. And so offering multiple opportunities that are equally rigorous and robust to these teachers, to give them an alternative to that licensure exam.
That's helpful. Tom, I'm curious what kind of roadblocks you anticipate if you are requiring a set of micro-credentials for licensure. What challenges do you anticipate?
So, you know, some of the challenges are getting the micro-credentials to flow back into the ed prep programs, of course, is like, so the idea would be that our educator prep programs that are providing the academic and the academic preparation for these teachers would also see that these teachers may need to be prepared to demonstrate the practice in an authentic setting. And how do we ensure that those programs are responding to the needs of the teacher, so as they enter the field, they're prepared to meet those performance requirements, as well as the academic requirements.
Bobette, there's a couple of questions for you. I'm curious. There's one from Sandra. Are micro-credentials an alternative to content knowledge exams, or the basic competency exams, or both? How are you thinking about that?
Right now, we call it an alternative assessment plan, but the teacher has to have a score on the praxis that is close to the cutoff score. We worked with ETS, and typically it's within -2 standard errors of measure. So we feel that that's a good measure of their content knowledge. Okay. But then if they're in that range, we believe that they have content knowledge, but maybe they're not a good test taker. So we want to let them show us what they know through the use of micro-credentials, so Thanks. They can earn those with students. There are a lot of other pieces that come into play with that. Districts have to sign on and put the teacher on a plan and provide additional supports, and so there are other elements to that.
Bobette, could you tell us if you use the statewide professional development grant to develop the system, and if so, would you recommend other states do that?
The state personnel development grant is working. Their funding is for micro-credentials around high leverage instructional practices. Okay. So, and again, they're working with the American Institute of Research is partnering with them to develop those, and they will be offered to teachers at no cost. So.
Dr. Kaufman, let me come back to you as a national provider. We've talked to a couple of states that are at varying levels of deployment. Is the NEA actively partnering with any states, or states using some or all of your library, and any comments on effective practices that have come up in our discussion that you want to mention?
Sure. So let me start with the effective practices, and then I'll talk about partnerships that we've worked with. So we've learned a lot in the past 6 years. Number one is there must be currency attached to the micro-credentials for them to be attractive for educators. And that could be a number of things. North Carolina, and we encourage others as well. They should be developed in some way into the professional development system. Some places have chosen to do that at the district level for PD requirements that sometimes you have to do at a school or a district. Some have done that at the state level, as we've talked about. We've also seen where folks have included them as part of their collective bargaining agreements, to where educators, as part of a professional learning system, X amount of micro-credentials can be considered gaining or earning pieces. Or micro-credentials, sometimes they're built into salary, sometimes they're built into stipends, it just depending on but without that currency as a best practice and considering it, we've found to be a non-starter. A couple of other things, ensuring that for states, as they're thinking about micro-credentials, has been mentioned, there are all kinds. And there's lots of different providers, and the quality varies greatly. As national providers, we have really tried to have the conversation around what should quality micro-credentials look like, and what should they include, and what does implementation look like. But it's a little self-serving for us to be determining what those are.
Right.
I think we should definitely have a say in that. But the states, a lot of times states, we don't have the capacity to figure out which ones are high quality and which ones aren't. How could we ever do this? And what we have seen some states do is actually create teacher panels, teachers who have been vetted or, have some experience with micro-credentials in some way. You bring the teachers together to look at potential micro-credentials that could be used, that then the state would have confidence in. So that's another best practice that we've really seen. There's a couple others I can go into, but I will talk forever if I keep going on and on.
Well, Anne, let me ask you a specific question, and then I'll allow other folks to chime in. So most micro-credentials sit in a continuing ed program. Is that a good idea or not?
Most of them fit inside of a continuing ed program. Say a little more by what you mean.
As far as the way states treat them.
I don't know that that's necessarily true.
Okay.
I think some of them use them as certification. I don't think some of them are sophisticated enough, or they haven't thought large enough to think about an actual professional learning plan. It's just, I need to meet, and Melissa Tooley has talked about this quite a bit. I need to meet X licensure requirement, check. I took that micro-credential. We know through research that knowledge that builds on each other is where you're going to learn the most, right? And where student learning is going to be impacted the most. So micro-credentials that actually are thoughtfully built in a playlist that can, earn them the relevant professional learning pieces, I think is important. But that is definitely not what's happening everywhere across the country.
All right, let's put a pin in that for just a second. Cynthia just mentioned that that Iowa allows the use of NEA credentials for renewal.
Correct.
And you like that, I assume. You think that's a good system?
Renewal is a great way that can fit into existing systems. There's lots of systems across the country that have micro-credentials as a potential. Colorado allows it, California allows it, Massachusetts allows it, South Carolina allows it. There's several states that have looked at this, and Tennessee, Michelle is much better talked about this, but Michelle really did this a lot when she was in Tennessee as well.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, Tom, if that's okay. I think a really nice entry point for policy, for this intersection of policy and micro-credentials, because it doesn't take, well, in Tennessee, it didn't take a huge shift in policy. It was more of an allowance, or the agreement to allow professional learning that occurs during the school day to count as as hours or currency toward the renewal of the license. And that was really the only piece, was before it had to be conducted outside of the workday, and lifting that single restriction then allowed micro-credentials to now be relevant in terms of the license renewal. So it's I think it's an easy entry point for states and systems that are looking for ways to begin to talk about micro-credentials and intersect micro-credentials with policy as they continue to build momentum in terms of making other possibly more significant shifts.
Michelle, I was speaking to folks in Wyoming yesterday, and the state of Wyoming, with the University of Wyoming, has led their micro-credentialing efforts around computer science. So a very specific entry point that they have found has been a really effective place. It's sort of a vacuum in their teacher professional development, and they've been quite successful at building really robust units of study. Other folks that we've heard have started with effective practice. Do you have advice on for states that are thinking about moving into this direction? Where would you start? Would it be with a specific subject, sort of new to the curriculum, like computer science, or with effective teacher practice? What's the right entry point?
I don't know if I know the right entry point, Tom, but I will say that I think that finding these, not niche, but smaller areas that are largely kind of underserved in terms of professional learning is a great way to get started. For example, our gifted and talented teachers in Nashville had, the opportunities for professional learning are somewhat minimal compared to the heftier subject areas like English language arts and math and STEM, which have really robust opportunities for professional learning. So an area like computer science or CTE is another great area to begin to dabble with micro-credentials. And gifted and talented, that are in many respects, these educators are really hungry for quality professional learning, is a nice place to begin, because the teachers are often very willing. They're less inundated with other things on their plates, and so we have found that they are quite willing to embark on, again, this kind of journey with micro-credentials, and then of course the snowball just grows from there.
I wonder, Tom, if you've stepped into this in a relatively high stakes environment of licensure. Do you see some benefit to stepping into new subject areas like computer science as a potential entry point for other states that are new to micro-credentials?
Well, I mean, I think it's one of the things that we're struggling with is how do micro-credentials serve kind of the content side of this? I mean, it's easy to see how it attaches to the pedagogical skills, but when you're using them for things like establishing somebody has the requisite knowledge to teach a computer science class or something else, it's a little less clear to us how that's going to manifest. And so that is definitely a challenge as we step into this arena of how do you use them for kind of these more, they're not performance-based issues, they're knowledge-based issues, and can micro-credentials serve that purpose? It's an interesting question.
That's an interesting point, Tom. Babette, what's your take on how would you advise other states that are interested in stepping into the space? Would you start in licensure, in renewal, in a practice area, or in a subject area?
That's a big question. And I think that, as Ann said, bringing teachers into the conversation, I think is really helpful. Arkansas has a teacher leader advisory group. And so they were very instrumental in our initial conversations around the career continuum and what that should look like, and those different pathways to earn that designation. So they were part of that conversation, looking at research. What does the research tell us? And when Michelle was talking about Louisiana and the using micro-credentials for mentor teachers, that's another area that Arkansas is wanting to use micro-credentials, because we know that if a teacher candidate is paired with an expert teacher during that student internship, she will be much more efficacious in the classroom. So we really want to, and we see a use for micro-credentials because, again, it is demonstrating that pedagogy and content knowledge that a new teacher would need to emulate. So there are just lots of places. So I think it's looking at your state and what your big buckets are and what could best support those.
Bobette, what about a vendor partner to host your micro-credentials? Do you have a single partner across the state? Do you encourage districts to use that partner, or are there several involved?
We have some districts that are strictly with one vendor partner. Again, that teacher leader advisory group, we looked at different pathways. And so we tried to create stacks of micro-credentials with vendors that were equivalent in weight, and that aligned with the teacher leader model standards and what we thought that lead professional role or the master professional role should look like.
Great. Tom, do you have a point of view on that?
Sorry, I was muted. So without getting too far deep into the weeds on what we're proposing to do, we are looking at a more tiered licensure system where we're recognizing advanced teachers who specifically have the skill in helping grow and develop other teachers, and a micro-credential system that would help us identify those folks with those skills and competencies would be great for really solidifying our mentorship program, as Bobette said. Like, we really are interested in identifying teachers who have those skills in growing the capacity of early career teachers. That's going to be tremendous for us if we can make that happen.
That's awesome. In the last couple of minutes, Michelle and Ann in particular, are there resources that you'd like to point people to where they can learn more about micro-credentials, particularly your work in micro-credentials? Michelle, any sites or reports you'd like to point us to?
We, Learning Forward did put out Micro-Credentials for Impact, which can be found on our website at learningforward.org. I would also just like to emphasize that one, I think, of the promises of micro-credentials is they are in many ways strongly aligned and support the standards for professional learning. There are lots of ways that you can see that micro-credentials can go in and help districts implement those and reach the hope of the standards. And so to that extent, I would just encourage you all to spend time thinking about ways in which you can reach and achieve the standards for professional learning through the support of micro-credentials.
And Ann, do you prefer a hyphen or not in micro-credentials?
I've always done a hyphen.
Do you use a hyphen, Ann?
Yeah, we do use a hyphen.
I
Our editor, like, that was a big conversation when we first started this, and our very intense editor was like, no, that has a hyphen. We're like, okay.
I'm laughing just because any of us that have published reports on micro-credentials have been in this argument. I prefer not having a. Michelle, are you a hyphen?
I'm hyphen. I got on board in the days of the hyphen.
And where can people learn more about your work in micro-credentials at the NEA?
Yeah, sure. I just put 2 links in the in the chat. One is for Certification Bank. That is our platform that we host for all of our micro-credentials. Many of our state affiliates also have portals within that so that they can target micro-credentials that are of special interest in particular states. And then we also host, for example, teaching with primary standards. So we are working with some nonprofits as well to bring the micro-credentials. And then the second link is just more information about what we're doing and how we're doing it. There's also some resources there about professional learning communities and guides for having micro-credential professional learning communities and those kinds of things. So.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Ann Kaufman from the NEA, Michelle Mills-Miles from Learning Forward, Tom Tomberland from North Carolina, Babette Ray from Arkansas. Thanks to my friend and colleague Myra Best from DigiLearn for hosting us today. I'll turn it back over to Erica from the Hunt Institute. Erica, thanks for being our host today.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. And thank you to all our panelists for leading us in this important discussion. I'm glad to see the debate over the hyphen didn't get too heated in the comments. And I also, again, want to thank our colleagues at DigiLearn for their partnership in making this discussion and series a success. I hope all of you who have joined us, whether for the first time or you've been part of all 3 sessions, have really found them helpful as we've explained the ins and outs of micro-credentials and how they can play a powerful role in the teaching profession. Before we officially close out, I want to turn everyone's attention to our upcoming K-12 Hunt Institute virtual events. On Monday, February 8th, we will be hosting a discussion about standards-based reform, where we'll highlight research from the organization EduDream about this movement and its effect on educational equity. And then on March 17th, we'll be hosting a discussion called Human Capital for the 21st Century, Aligning Education with Future Workforce Needs. Really, it's all there in the title, but we'll be discussing the increasing need for high-quality workforce development initiatives. We'll be sending an email and also posting on social media to remind you all to join these upcoming conversations. But for now, we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.